Section 46 of England Since Waterloo by John Arthur Ransome Marriott. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 23. The New Toryism, Imperium et Sanitas, 1874 to 1878, Part 2. Mr. Disraeli's choice of a successor was characteristic. He selected as first Viceroy under the new regime one who shared his own imaginative faculties, a brilliant man of letters and an experienced diplomatist. Lord Lytton was the son of his old friend Bulwer Lytton, and was himself known in the Republic of Letters as Owen Meredith. The first task which awaited the new Viceroy was to prepare for the fitting proclamation of the Empress. A magnificent Durbar was held at Delhi in the closing days of the year 1876, and on January 1st, 1877, a series of celebrations culminated in the proclamation of Queen Victoria as Empress of India in the presence of 63 ruling princes and amid the acclamations of the most brilliant assemblage ever brought together in British India. It was not, however, merely in order to add security to the Empire that Disraeli conferred upon his mistress the imperial crown of India. He hoped also to add splendor even to her throne. This, too, was part of a deliberate policy. The principles of the English Constitution do not contemplate the absence of personal influence on the part of the sovereign, and if they did, the principles of human nature would prevent the fulfilment of such a theory. Disraeli's words were not a mere rhetorical flourish. They had conviction behind them and intention. The popularity of the Queen had touched its nadir in the last few years. During the decade which followed the Prince Consort's death, the Queen's health was less robust than usual, and once, September 1871, it gave cause for some anxiety. She felt constrained, therefore, to make her choice between assiduous attention to the routine business of the State and participation in public ceremonial. The latter was naturally distasteful to her in the early years of her widowhood, and for some time the nation was acquiescent and sympathetic. But as the years went on and the seclusion of the sovereign seemed likely to be permanent, murmurings arose and grew louder and louder. The Times lent its weight to attacks of increasing vehemence. The living, it wrote, have their claims as well as the dead. A Punch cartoon portrayed the Queen as Hermione, while Britannia, as Pauline, was made to address the Queen, "'Tis time, descend, be stone no more." The Queen was deeply pained, but quite obdurate. She was acting, she believed, in accordance with the plainest dictates of duty. Very few people know how superbly she continued to stand sentry to the business of her empire. The Queen deeply resented the reticence of her ministers on this delicate point. They might and ought, in her opinion, to have explained the situation and saved her from unmerited reproof. Mr. Gladstone, on the contrary, felt it his duty to remonstrate with her. He was genuinely alarmed lest her persistence in seclusion should weaken the hold of the monarchy upon the nation. And his alarm was not groundless. After the fall of the French Empire, there was a clearly marked wave of republican feeling in England. When the House of Commons in 1871 was asked to vote £15,000 a year to Prince Arthur, afterwards the Duke of Connaught, no less than 51 members voted in favour of reducing the grant to £10,000. There was a noisy and malignant attack on the reputed affluence of the Queen herself in the same year, and in 1872 Sir Charles Dilke, boldly avowing himself to be a convinced Republican, moved for a full parliamentary inquiry into the expenditure of the Crown. From that moment, however, the tide turned. The Queen's own illness in 1871, followed in the same year by the far more serious illness of the Prince of Wales, evoked profound sympathy among her people, and when in February 1872 the Queen attended with the Prince a service of public thanksgiving at St. Paul's Cathedral, she received an enthusiastic welcome. The mists of prejudice were quickly dissipated, and a marked reaction in the Queen's favour set in. Her own spirits were much improved by the substitution, of Disraeli for Gladstone as First Minister. Disraeli, though no sycophant, was a courtier, and the Queen gave him her confidence in a measure not bestowed upon any of his less tactful predecessors. With him, however, it was a question not of personal deference but of political principle, and the reward which he sought and found was the revival not only of the personal popularity of the sovereign, but of the place of the monarchy in the Constitution. The purchase of the canal shares, the assumption of the imperial crown of India, were parts of a coherent whole. Disraeli's attitude toward the complex problems roused into fresh life by events in the Near East was determined by precisely the same considerations. Lord Palmerston was always ready and anxious to assert the rights of Englishmen the whole world over, but his outlook upon diplomacy was, if not insular, at least European. Disraeli was the first minister since Canning, perhaps since Chatham, to think imperially. He never forgot that the Queen was the ruler of Mohammedans as well as Christians, of Asiatics, Africans, Australians, and Americans as well as Europeans. He regarded the Eastern question, therefore, with the eye of an Oriental as well as an Occidental statesman. The ink was hardly dry on the Treaty of Paris, 1856, before it became obvious that the Crimean War had not permanently solved the Eastern question. Among the divided and heterogeneous population subject to the Turk, there was almost perpetual unrest. In 1858 there were insurrectionary movements in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and Montenegrin troops crossed the frontier into the latter province. Moldavia and Wallachia were anxious to unite, but the powers, though assenting to their virtual independence, decreed that they must remain separate principalities. With great ingenuity, however, the two states cut the knot by electing the same ruler, Prince Alexander Kuza. Europe wisely accepted the accomplished fact, and in 1859 recognized the union of the two Romanic principalities under the title of Romania. In 1862 Servia expelled the Turkish garrisons, and in the same year the Greeks broke out into revolt, expelled King Otto, and offered their uneasy crown to Prince Alfred of England. But the protecting powers, England, France, and Russia, had pledged themselves not to allow any of their cadets to accept the throne, and in 1863 England obtained for the Greeks the services of a Danish prince, now King George, and at the same time presented him with the Ionian Isles. Crete was only kept quiet, 1866 to 1868, by the intervention of the Powers, and in 1875 the whole Eastern question was again reopened by the outbreak of insurrection among the peoples of Bosnia and Herzegovina, supported by volunteers from Servia and Montenegro. Whether that insurrection was spontaneous or whether it was stimulated from St. Petersburg is a question which it is not easy to decide. Russia was, at any rate, not sorry to have the opportunity of fishing again in troubled waters. It had been plain for some time past that Tsar Alexander did not intend to accept as final the results of the Crimean War. He had, as we have seen, taken advantage in 1870 of the preoccupation of Europe to denounce the Treaty of Paris in regard to the neutrality of the Black Sea, a neutrality which Disraeli declared to be the very basis and gist of the Treaty of Paris of 1856, the main object of the war, the great result, for the accomplishment of which this country and France and their allies made the vast sacrifices now so freely acknowledged. The insurrection of 1875 gave the Tsar a still larger opportunity. Turkey now had nearly 20 years of grace in which to put her house in order, but all the fair promises made in 1856 had gone to the winds. Admitted to the polite society of Europe by the Treaty of Paris, the Porte had continued to behave as a barbarian. The lot of the Christians was no whit better than before the Crimean War, and all unofficial classes groaned under the oppressiveness and uncertainty of a fiscal system which nevertheless starved the treasury. For it is one of the salutary paradoxes incidental to misgovernment that it is as ruinous to the sovereign as it is hurtful to the subject. The inherent extravagance of a bad system combined with the peculation of an army of officials to bring disaster upon Turkey, and in October 1875 the Sultan was compelled to inform his creditors that he could not pay the full interest on the debt. Partial repudiation complicated an international situation already sufficiently embarrassing. The three emperors took counsel together, and on December 30th, 1875, the Austrian Chancellor, Count Andrassy, issued from Budapest the note which bears his name. The Andrassy note expressed the anxiety of the powers to curtail the area of the insurrection and to maintain the peace of Europe. It drew attention to the failure of the Porte to carry out reforms long overdue, and it insisted that pressure must be put upon the Sultan effectually to redeem his promises. In particular, he must be pressed to grant complete religious liberty, to abolish tax farming, to apply the direct taxes locally levied in Bosnia and Herzegovina to the local needs of those provinces, to improve the condition of the rural population by multiplying peasant owners, and above all to appoint a special commission composed in equal numbers of Mussulmans and Christians to control the execution not only of the reforms now demanded by the powers, but also of those spontaneously promised by the Sultan in the decrees of October 2nd and December 12th. To this note the British government gave in their general adhesion, though they pointed out that the Sultan had, during the last few months, promised the more important of the reforms indicated therein. The note was accordingly presented to the Porte at the end of January 1876, and the Sultan, with almost suspicious promptitude, accepted 4 out of the 5 points, the exception being the application of the direct tax to local objects. The friendly efforts of the diplomatists were foiled, however, by the attitude of the insurgents. The latter refused, not unnaturally, to be satisfied with mere assurances, or to lay down their arms without substantial guarantees. The Sultan insisted again, not without reason, that it was impossible to initiate a scheme of reform while the provinces were actually in armed rebellion. Meanwhile the mischief was spreading. Bulgaria broke out into revolt in April. At the beginning of May a fanatical Mohammedan émeute at Salonika led to the murder of the French and German consuls. The Sultan Abdulaziz was deposed on May 30th, and on June 4th was found dead, having apparently committed suicide. More drastic measures were obviously necessary if a great European conflagration was to be avoided. On May 11th the Austrian and Russian Chancellors were in conference with Prince Bismarck at Berlin, and determined to make further and more peremptory demands upon the Sultan. There was to be an immediate armistice of 2 months' duration, during which certain measures of pacification and repatriation were to be executed under the superintendence of the delegates of the powers. If by the expiry of the armistice the object of the powers had not been attained, diplomatic action would have to be reinforced. France and Italy assented to the note, but the British government regarded the terms as unduly peremptory. They resented the independent action of the 3 imperial powers and declined to be a party to the memorandum. Accordingly, the proposed intervention was abandoned. Mr. Disraeli's refusal created, as was inevitable, profound perturbation abroad, and evoked a storm of criticism at home. Out of the welter of charges and countercharges some points have now emerged with tolerable clearness. The European concert, whatever it was worth, was broken by the policy of Great Britain. Had the British Cabinet gone wholeheartedly with the other powers, irresistible pressure would have been put upon the Porte, and some terrible atrocities might perhaps have been averted. On the other hand, it is clear that the Imperial Chancellors were encouraged in an attitude which was almost insolent by the belief that England would never again commit the crime of the Crimean War. They presumed upon the pacific tendencies manifested by Great Britain in recent years, and were misled, much as the Tsar Nicholas was misled by the amiability of Lord Aberdeen. into the belief that Great Britain might be regarded as a quantité négligible in European diplomacy. If they sincerely desired the preservation of peace, they committed an inexcusable blunder in not inviting the cooperation of England before formulating the demands of the Berlin Memorandum. Events now moved rapidly. On May 24th, the government ordered the British fleet in the Mediterranean to sail for Bezika Bay. The disorder in Constantinople was in itself sufficient justification for this precaution, but by the Turks it was unhappily interpreted as an encouragement to defiance of the will of the continental powers, perhaps also as an indication that they might safely show themselves to be masters in their own house. They showed it in a characteristic fashion. Some disorders in Bulgaria led to terrible reprisals. A horde of irregular soldiery, the Bashi-Bazouks, was let loose upon a half-armed peasantry, and all Europe was made to ring with an account of the atrocities committed in the name of the Ottoman Sultan. How much of exaggeration there was in the accounts published in England and elsewhere it was and is impossible to say, but something much less than the ascertained facts would be sufficient to make the historian avert his own eyes and those of his readers with all possible rapidity from a scene so terrible. In July, Mr. Walter Baring was sent out by the British government to Adrianople to ascertain, if possible, the truth. His final report was not issued until September, but preliminary reports so far substantiated the accounts which had been published in the English press as to move the conscience of England to its depths. In a dispatch to Sir Henry Elliot, British ambassador to the Porte, Lord Derby gave expression in language not less strong by reason of its restraint to the feelings of indignation aroused in England by the accounts of the Bulgarian atrocities, and instructed him to demand from the Sultan prompt and effective reparation for the victims. But a voice more powerful than that of Lord Derby was already making articulate the feelings of his countrymen. To Mr. Gladstone the tale of atrocities made an irresistible appeal. A pamphlet published on September 6 was circulated by tens of thousands. *The Bulgarian Horrors and the Question of the East. With voice and pen he vehemently demanded that the Turks should be cleared out, bag and baggage, from the province they have desolated and profaned. Long before this, however, another complication had arisen. In June, Servia and Montenegro had declared war upon the Porte. How far would that conflict extend? Could it be confined within the original limits? These were the serious questions with which diplomacy was now confronted. The Servian army consisted largely of Russian volunteers, and was commanded by a Russian general. How long would it be before the Russian government became a party to the quarrel? The Servian army, even reinforced by the volunteers, could offer but feeble resistance to the Turk, and in August Prince Milan, acting on a hint from England, asked for the mediation of the powers. England thereupon urged the Sultan to come to terms with Servia and Montenegro, lest a worse thing should befall him. The Sultan, however, declined an armistice, but formulated his terms and intimated that if the powers approved them he would grant an immediate suspension of hostilities. But to Lord Derby's chagrin, Servia would accept nothing less than an armistice, and after 6 weeks' suspension hostilities recommenced. Nevertheless, Lord Derby was untiring in his efforts to promote a pacification, and suggested, September 21st, to the powers some heads of proposals: the status quo in Servia and Montenegro, local or administrative autonomy for Bosnia and Herzegovina, guarantees against maladministration in Bulgaria, and a comprehensive scheme of reform, all to be embodied in a protocol concluded between the Porte and the powers. Russia then proposed, September 26th, that in the event of a refusal from Turkey, the Allied fleets should enter the Bosphorus, that Bosnia should be temporarily occupied by Austria, Bulgaria by Russia. Turkey thereupon suggested an armistice of 6 months. Russia demurred, and eventually 6 weeks was agreed upon. Lord Derby was determined that the breathing space should be utilized for one more effort to preserve the peace of Europe. At his suggestion a conference met in Constantinople in December, and Lord Salisbury attended it as the chief representative of Great Britain. The Powers agreed to the terms suggested by Lord Derby in September, but the Porte was obdurate. Profuse in his professions and promises of reform, the Porte stubbornly refused to allow Europe to superintend their execution. General Ignatieff, the Russian delegate, thereupon withdrew from the conference, and Russia proceeded to mobilize her troops. Diplomacy, however, made one more effort to preserve peace. On March 31st, 1877, the Powers signed in London a protocol put forward by Count Shuvalov. Taking cognizance of the Turkish promises of reform, the Powers declared their intention of watching carefully the manner in which the promises of the Ottoman government are carried into effect. If, however, the condition of the Christian subjects of the Porte should again lead to a return of the complications which periodically disturb the peace of the East, they think it right to declare that such a state of things would be incompatible with their interests and those of Europe in general. The Turk in high dudgeon rejected the protocol April 10th, and on April 24th Russia declared war. Single-handed, the Tsar intended to extort by force of arms those guarantees which the Sultan had refused to the collective demand of Europe. Russia, it must be confessed, had behaved in face of prolonged provocation with considerable patience and restraint, and had shown a commendable desire to maintain the European concert. The Turk had exhibited throughout his usual mixture of shrewdness and obstinacy. It is difficult to believe that he would have maintained his obstinate front but for expectations based upon the supposed goodwill of the British Government. The language of the Prime Minister and the Foreign Secretary had unquestionably given him some encouragement, so much so that before the break-up of the conference Lord Salisbury telegraphed to Lord Derby from Constantinople: "The Grand Vizier believes that he can count upon the assistance of Lord Derby and Lord Beaconsfield." The Turk, it is true, is an adept at diplomatic bluff, and assistance went beyond the facts. But this much is certain: if the English Cabinet had, even in January 1877, frankly and unambiguously gone hand in hand with Russia, there would have been no war. The details of the campaign must not detain us. Suffice it to say that for Russia it was no mere military parade. The Russian army crossed the Danube in June, and it was many months before their main army could pierce the Balkans. In their path was the great fortress of Plevna, and for 5 months Osman Pasha resisted all the efforts made by the Russians to capture it. At last, on December 10th, Plevna surrendered to General Todleben. Before the end of January 1878, the Russian army reached Adrianople, and in February Constantinople itself was threatened. A basis of agreement had already been reached at Adrianople, January 31st. The terms were now embodied in a treaty signed on March 3rd at a village not far from Constantinople. Montenegro, Servia, and Romania were to be recognized definitely as independent of the Porte, and certain frontier districts were to be ceded to them. The reforms recommended to the Porte at the Conference of Constantinople were to be immediately introduced into Bosnia and Herzegovina, the Danubian fortresses to be razed, reforms were to be granted to the Armenians, Russia was to acquire, in lieu of the greater part of the money indemnity which she claimed, Batum, Kars, and other territory in Asia, and certain districts on the Romanian frontier to be exchanged with Romania for the strip of Bessarabia retroceded in 1856. But the most striking feature of the treaty was the creation of a Greater Bulgaria, which was to be constituted an autonomous tributary principality with a Christian government and a national militia, and was to extend from the Danube to the Aegean Sea, nearly as far south as Medea on the Black Sea, Adrianople and Salonika, and to include on the west the district round Monastir. Bulgaria would thus have comprised more than half of the Balkan peninsula. These terms excited alarm and jealousy in Greece and in the Balkan states. How were they regarded by Europe in general and Great Britain in particular? Ever since the outbreak of the Russo-Turkish War, the British government had watched with deepening anxiety the development of events in Eastern Europe. Mr. Gladstone indeed identified the cause of Russia with the cause of freedom and justice, but among statesmen he stood almost alone. The government declared their policy to be one of rigid neutrality so long as Egypt, the Suez Canal, and Constantinople were not threatened, and when that policy was formally challenged by Mr. Gladstone, their majority rose far above their normal figure to 131. If the Cabinet were not wholly united at this moment, neither were the opposition leaders. Mr. Gladstone's vehemence on the Eastern question strained severely the loyalty of his late colleagues. "I feel certain," wrote Lord Hartington to Lord Granville, "that the Whigs and moderate Liberals in the House are a good deal disgusted, and I am much afraid that if he goes on much further, nothing can prevent a break-up of the party." His opponents were not much better off. In private conversation, Mr. Disraeli gave a humorous account of the 6 parties in the Cabinet. The first party is that which is for immediate war with Russia. The second party is for war to save Constantinople. The third party is the party of peace at any price. The fourth party would let the Russians take Constantinople and would then turn them out. The fifth party desires to plant the cross on the dome of St. Sophia. And then there are the Prime Minister and the Chancellor of the Exchequer, who desire to see something done, but don't know exactly what. The Russian victories at the end of 1877 deepened anxieties and accentuated differences. In January 1878, Lord Derby warned Russia that an occupation of the Dardanelles by her army would endanger the good relations between herself and Great Britain, and 3 days afterwards thought it necessary to remind her that any treaty concluded between Turkey and Russia which affected the engagements of 1856 and 1878 would not be valid without the assent of the powers who were parties of those treaties. January 14th. Parliament, called together at an ominously early date, January 17th, was informed by the Queen that should hostilities be unfortunately prolonged, some unexpected occurrence may render it incumbent on me to adopt measures of precaution. It was soon apparent what was in the mind of ministers. Northcote gave notice that they would ask the House for an additional £6 million for armaments, and on January 23rd the fleet was ordered to sail for the Dardanelles. Upon the public announcement of this menacing step, Lord Carnarvon and Lord Derby resigned. The former was succeeded at the Colonial Office by Sir Michael Hicks Beach. The latter withdrew his resignation when the fleet was recalled to Pazika Bay. On January 28th, Northcote, in moving the vote, made public the terms demanded by Russia, which, in addition to the points subsequently embodied in the Treaty of San Stefano, included an ulterior understanding for safeguarding the rights and interests of Russia in the Straits. This was the point in regard to which she had already been warned by Lord Derby, and the situation became critical in the extreme. In the preliminary terms signed between the combatants on January 31st, this stipulation disappeared, but in consequence of excited telegrams from Mr. Layard, the British ambassador in Constantinople, the Cabinet decided, February 7th, to send a detachment of the fleet into the Sea of Marmara for the protection of British subjects in Constantinople. Russia retorted that if British ships sailed up the Straits, Russian troops would enter Constantinople for the purpose of similarly protecting the lives of Christians of every race. The Sultan, however, withdrew the leave necessary to enable ships of war to pass the Dardanelles. On March 3rd, tension was relieved by the signature of the Treaty of San Stefano, but only for the moment. The Austrian government had been moving in the matter of a European Congress, and on March 4th Lord Derby informed Count Beust that Great Britain agreed to the suggestion, provided it was clearly understood that all questions dealt with in the Treaty of Peace between Russia and Turkey should be considered as subjects to be discussed in the Congress. This had been throughout the keynote of our policy, the diapason of our diplomacy. With regard to the Treaty of San Stefano, the language of Lord Beaconsfield was emphatic. It abolishes the dominion of the Ottoman Empire in Europe. It creates a large state which, under the name of Bulgaria, is inhabited by many races not Bulgarian, and all the European dominions of the Ottoman Porte are put under the administration of Russia. The effect of all the stipulations combined will be to make the Black Sea as much of a Russian lake as the Caspian. Whether this description was exaggerated or no, there can be no question that in every clause the treaty was a deviation from those of 1856 and 1871, and as such required the assent of the signatory powers. To the demand that the treaty in its entirety should be submitted to a Congress, Russia demurred. Great Britain insisted. Again things looked like war. Lord Derby, the most pacific member of the Cabinet, resigned March 28th. On April 1st, Lord Beaconsfield announced that Parliament would be asked to authorize the calling out of the reserves, and on April 2nd, Lord Salisbury, the new Foreign Secretary, issued a masterly memorandum placing before the Powers the case of Great Britain. Peace hung in the balance. Apart from the dispute between England and Russia, there was a great deal of inflammable material about to which a match would set light. Greece, Servia, and Roumania were all gravely dissatisfied with the terms of the Treaty of San Stefano. Greece had actually invaded Thessaly at the beginning of February, and had only consented to abstain from further hostilities upon the assurance of the Powers that her claims should have favourable consideration in the definitive treaty of peace. Parliament adjourned for the Easter recess on April 16th, reassured as to the prospects of peace by a speech from the Chancellor of the Exchequer. On the following morning, the Times made the sensational announcement that Lord Beaconsfield had ordered 7,000 Indian troops to embark for Malta. That the coup was dramatic none will dispute, but it has been variously judged. The disciples of Disraeli contended that it revealed as by a flashlight the resources upon which England could draw, and thus powerfully contributed to the maintenance of peace. His enemies declared that it smacked of transpontine melodrama rather than of the sober traditions of English statesmanship. Mr. Gladstone impeached the policy as gravely unconstitutional. Lord Selborne declared it to be illegal. The historical critic must admit that the move was consistent with the whole trend of Lord Beaconsfield's policy, and must insist that if it alarmed England, it impressed Europe, and that it made for peace. Before the end of May, the Indian troops began to arrive at Malta. On the 30th, Lord Salisbury and Count Shuvalov came to an agreement on the main points at issue, and on June 13th the Congress opened at Berlin. Prince Bismarck, of course, presided. The English plenipotentiaries were the Prime Minister and the Foreign Secretary. The Congress marked the zenith of one of the most remarkable careers in English parliamentary history. Lord Beaconsfield figured for a moment as the dictator of Europe. Der alte Jude, das ist der Mann. Such was Bismarck's pregnant summary of the situation. The day after the Congress met, the world was informed through the fraud of a Foreign Office clerk of all the details of the convention concluded between Lord Salisbury and Count Shuvalov on May 30th. The critics of the government pointed to this as one more instance of the shameless duplicity of English diplomacy at this juncture. The Congress, after all, was a hollow sham, and much to the like effect. Reflection will surely reverse such contemporary criticism. No prudent diplomatist would go into open Congress without a clear understanding on the main points with his principal antagonist. Lord Beaconsfield and Lord Salisbury had not omitted this wise precaution, though insufficient care had been exercised in preserving official secrecy. They had taken also another precaution not prematurely disclosed. By a convention dated June 4th, They had agreed with Turkey that so long as Russia retained Kars and other recent conquests in Armenia, the island of Cyprus was to be occupied and administered by Great Britain. Turkey was to receive the surplus revenues of the island to carry out reforms in her Asiatic dominions and to be protected in them by Great Britain. The Treaty of Berlin was signed on July 13th. The great point on which it differed from the Treaty of San Stefano was in regard to Greater Bulgaria. Bulgaria, as defined at Berlin, was not more than a third of the Bulgaria mapped out at San Stefano. It was to consist of a relatively narrow strip between the Danube and the Balkans, and to be an independent state under Turkish suzerainty. South of it there was to be a province, Eastern Roumelia, which was to be restored to the Sultan, who agreed to place it under a Christian governor, approved by the Powers. By this change the Sultan recovered 2,500,000 of population and 30,000 square miles of territory. Bosnia and Herzegovina were handed over to Austrian occupation, an occupation which has proved to be permanent. The Greeks obtained, but not until 1881, an unimportant rectification of their northern frontier. For the rest, the terms of San Stefano were confirmed. The essential differences between the two treaties consisted in the aggrandizement of Austria-Hungary and the partition of Greater Bulgaria. The latter arrangement was not permanent. In 1885, Prince Alexander of Battenberg, who had accepted in 1879 the Principality of Bulgaria, yielded to the clearly expressed will of the people and agreed to the union of the two Bulgarias. The diplomatic position was now entirely reversed. Russia was indignant. Great Britain not merely acquiescent, but approving. The explanation is simple. Russia had played her cards in Bulgaria as badly as they could be played. In opposition to her high-handed and self-seeking methods, there had grown up a strong national party. The Greater Bulgaria of 1878 would have been a Russian province, within striking distance of Constantinople. The Bulgaria of 1885 was, as Lord Salisbury, again in office, clearly perceived, a sure bulwark against Russia. If, wrote Sir Robert Morier to Sir William White, you can help to build up these people into a bulwark of independent states and thus screen the sick man from the fury of the northern blast, for God's sake do it. With Lord Salisbury's help, Sir William White did it, and thus, in Morier's words, a state has been evolved out of the protoplasm of Balkan chaos. It is fair to remember that but for Lord Beaconsfield's action in 1878, that evolution would have been impossible. On July 16th, the British ministers returned from Berlin and were received with the wildest acclamations by the London crowd. Lord Beaconsfield clearly interpreted the feelings of London, if not of England, when he declared in historic phrase that he had brought back peace with honour. Peace was indubitable, as to honour opinion was divided. The envoys received the Order of the Garter from their sovereign, and the freedom of the city from the merchants and bankers of the capital, but the public voice was not unanimous in the endorsement of these honours. The history of the Eastern question between 1875 and 1878 raises many difficult problems in political ethics. The first and broadest is the general right of intervention in the internal concerns of sovereign states. In opposition to the Holy Allies, Lord Castlereagh had laid down the sound principle that with the internal affairs of each separate state we have nothing to do. His protest was addressed to absolute monarchs, and it is worth recalling in order to remind impatient philanthropists that intervention is necessarily a double-edged weapon. Employed in the defence of oppressed nationalities today, it may be used tomorrow in the interests of autocracy. The only safe rule is clearly that of Lord Castlereagh. But no rule is without exceptions, more especially in politics. Did the condition of the Ottoman dominions in 1875 provide one? It is impossible to dismiss lightly the argument put forward by Mr. Gladstone in 1876 through 1878, and by the Duke of Argyll in 1896. In the latter year they were the only two survivors of the cabinet which waged the Crimean War. That war, its conduct and its issue, had, in their view, imposed upon Great Britain a peculiar responsibility in regard to the government of the Turk in general, and in particular his treatment of his Christian subjects. That responsibility will hardly be denied, but its existence does not determine the manner and time of fulfilling it. Nor must it blind us to another truth of equal weight. "We support Turkey," said Lord Palmerston in 1853, "for our own sake and for our own interests." The policy of Great Britain from first to last has been that of protecting Turkey with a view to the repulse of Russia from an exclusive and dangerous dominion over the east of Europe. But the buffer consisted, after all, of human beings, and to their well-being we could not be indifferent. One cardinal mistake Lord Beaconsfield had made, that of separating Great Britain from the other powers in the Berlin Memorandum. That separation led, though not immediately, to the single-handed intervention of Russia. But that intervention rendered it absolutely essential that in any general settlement the influence of Great Britain should be decisively exercised. The treaty which closed this chapter of the Eastern question may not have been ideal. It was not destined to be final. But this at least may be said of it: it did not leave the cat's paw of Russia within striking distance of Constantinople. The treaty torn up by Lord Beaconsfield did. Whether the difference between them was worth the risk of a European war is a question which posterity must decide. End of Section 46. Section 47 of England since Waterloo by John Arthur Ransome Marriott. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 24. Afghanistan and South Africa, 1878 to 1880, Part 1. It is the fashion to deny that history ever repeats itself. Such denials are confronted with an awkward illustration in Afghanistan. The story to be discussed in this chapter repeats with singular precision the experience of the preceding generation, with one characteristic and suggestive difference. The intertwining of events in Europe and Asia is much more intricate than was the case 40 years earlier. On the day when the diplomatists met in Congress at Berlin, June 13th, 1878, the Amir of Afghanistan learnt at Kabul that a Russian mission was on its way to his capital. A week after Lord Beaconsfield returned to London, bringing back peace with honor from Berlin, General Stolotov, in command of the Russian mission, reached Kabul and was received with every possible mark of distinction by Sher Ali, July 22nd. English diplomacy had headed off Russia from the Dardanelles. Was Russian diplomacy going to take its revenge on the Khyber? The disastrous events of the early 40s had made, naturally enough, a profound impression upon British policy in India. Successive governments had pursued since then a consistent policy of masterly inactivity in Central Asia. Russia employed the opportunity for steady, though stealthy, advance. Dost Muhammad did not understand the policy of masterly inactivity. Again and again he pressed Sir John Lawrence, 1863 through 1869, to take under the protection of the British government his designated heir, Sher Ali. Lawrence persistently declined to interfere in the domestic politics of Afghanistan. By 1868, however, Sher Ali, without British assistance, had made himself master of his brethren and of the wild tribes who had owned his father's sway. Lawrence thereupon recognized the de facto ruler and sent him a congratulatory message and a present of money and arms. The Amir did not fail to perceive that these compliments coincided with the capture of Samarkand by Russia in 1868. The Russian advance in Central Asia was now giving some uneasiness to Great Britain, and in January 1873 the frontiers between the two powers in Asia were formally defined by treaty. The ink was hardly dry upon the treaty when the news arrived that Russia had occupied Khiva, June 1873. Count Shuvalov assured the British Government that the occupation was a purely temporary expedient, but the moment of evacuation had not yet arrived. At Khiva, Russia was within 400 miles of the northwestern frontier of British India. By this time Lawrence had given place to Lord Mayo, and Mayo, struck down by the hand of a fanatic, had been succeeded by Lord Northbrook. On the eve of his departure from India, 1869, Lawrence indited a despatch which indicates, not obscurely, some change of policy, advised a clear understanding with the Court of St. Petersburg as to its projects and designs in Central Asia, and that it might be given to understand in firm and courteous language that it cannot be permitted to interfere in the affairs of Afghanistan or in those of any state which lies contiguous to our frontier. Such an intimation to Russia was clearly inconsistent with the policy of masterly inactivity to which Lawrence had throughout his long tenure of office adhered, but that policy still dominated the Council in Whitehall. Sher Ali was at least as much alarmed by the approach of Russia as was Lawrence, but he could get no effective assurance of support from Lord Mayo, still less from Lord Northbrook. In 1873, when the Russians were actually marching on Khiva, Sher Ali tried to persuade the Viceroy that the interests of the Afghan and English governments are identical, and that the border of Afghanistan is in truth the border of India. Northbrook, obviously perturbed, telegraphed home for instructions. The reply is historic. "Cabinet thinks you should inform Amir we do not at all share his alarm and consider there is no cause for it, but you may assure him we shall maintain our settled policy in favour of Afghanistan if he abides by our advice in external affairs." This was one of the clear cases where telegraphy has proved a curse to the Government of India. Lord Northbrook obeyed his instructions to the letter. The Amir got 20,000 rifles and a large present of money. He did not get the assurance he wanted. The year 1873 marks, as has been truly said, a fatal turning point in Anglo-Afghan relations. Northbrook's refusal turned Sher Ali from a friend into an enemy, and he decided, as his father had done 40 years before, to throw in his lot with Russia. In 1874 a new government came into power. The boot was now on the other foot. Lord Salisbury was anxious to induce the Amir to accept a British resident. Lord Lytton, who succeeded Lord Northbrook as Viceroy in 1876, endeavoured to persuade him to accept a comprehensive treaty, but in vain. The Amir, repulsed by one Viceroy after another, had made up his mind to look for support in another direction. Meanwhile, the British Government concluded with the Khan of Kalat in Balochistan the important Treaty of Jacobabad, December 1876, a treaty which gave us the right of garrisoning Quetta, a position which turns the flank of the Afghan frontier, opposed to India, along the mountain across the Indus. This diplomatic success alarmed the Amir, but not sufficiently to induce him to receive a British resident. The reception of the Russian mission in 1878 compelled Lord Lytton to immediate and decisive action, though the opportune conclusion of the Treaty of Berlin led to amended instructions to the Russian envoy. General Stolietoff was bidden not to go generally as far as would have been advisable if war with England had been threatened. Such instructions, however, could not, even had they been known, affect the policy of Great Britain. Lord Lytton took the only possible step in announcing to the Amir that a British envoy of high rank, Sir Neville Chamberlain, would proceed to Kabul forthwith. The mission, with an escort of about 1,000 men, left Peshawar on September 21st. Sir Neville took the precaution of sending forward Major Cavagnari to demand leave for the mission to proceed. Leave was refused. It was made clear to General Chamberlain that he would encounter armed resistance, and the mission was disbanded. Nothing, as Chamberlain wrote, could have been more humiliating to the British Crown and nation. To the refusal to receive an envoy from the Queen Empress, at a moment, moreover, when a Russian mission was actually in Kabul, there could be but one answer. A large force was mobilized for the invasion of Afghanistan, but before it marched an ultimatum was sent to Sher Ali to demand a full and immediate apology and the reception of a permanent embassy in Afghanistan. On November 21st, the force, 30,000 to 40,000 strong, advanced in 3 columns, one by the Khyber Pass under the command of Sir Samuel Brown, another through the Kuram Valley under Major General Roberts, the third under Sir Donald Stewart was to advance through the Bolan Pass on Kandahar. Before the end of December, Brown had reached Jalalabad, Roberts had fought his way through the Shutar Garden Pass, and in January Stewart entered Kandahar. Sher Ali, realizing the hopelessness of resistance, fled into Turkestan with such members of the Russian mission as lingered at Kabul, and there in February 1879 he died. His son, Yaqub Khan, established himself in Kabul. In May he presented himself to General Brown's camp at Kandamak, and terms of peace were quickly arranged. By the Treaty of Kandamak, Yaqub Khan agreed to receive a permanent British embassy with a suitable escort at Kabul, to conduct his foreign policy under the advice of Great Britain, to give facilities for trade, and to allow such a rectification of the northwestern frontier as was demanded by the scientific school of British strategists. In return, he was to be supported against external aggression and to receive an annual subsidy of 6 lakhs of rupees. The news of the conclusion of peace was received with much satisfaction in England, and the Government congratulated itself and the country on the attainment of a scientific frontier. Lord Lawrence's warnings were ignored, the advocates of the forward policy triumphed, the Indian frontier was to rest not upon the Indus but upon the command of the passes. One of the great soldiers who had made the war had forebodings about the peace. General Roberts thought that peace had been signed too quickly, and that it ought to have been dictated in Kabul. The forebodings were only too sadly justified. Sir Louis Cavagnari, whose diplomatic tact had done so much to smooth the negotiations at Kandamak, accepted the mission to Kabul. Taking with him only a small escort, he reached the capital in July. In September, he and all his comrades were murdered by the Amir's mutinous soldiery. The news reached Simla on September 4th, and 2 days later Roberts left to take command of the Kabul field force. Stewart's army had hardly left Kandahar, which was at once reoccupied. Roberts and his little force reached Kabul early in October. Yaqub promptly abdicated and was deported to India. Efforts were made to discover Cavagnari's murderers, and the city and district around it were placed under martial law. Roberts found Kabul much more Russian than English, the officers arrayed in uniforms of Russian pattern, Russian money in the treasury, and Russian wares in the bazaars. Before he left, he brought to light much evidence as to Russian designs in Afghanistan, and he placed it on formal record that, in his opinion, the recent rupture with Sher Ali had been the means of unmasking and checking a very serious conspiracy against the peace and security of our Indian Empire. Meanwhile, his own position in Kabul was far from secure. Again and again he had to beat off the tribesmen, and not until the end of December did reinforcements reach him from India. Early in May of 1880, Stewart and his division, after a successful engagement at Ahmed Khel near Ghazni, joined him at Kabul. Before this, an important political decision had been arrived at. To retain Afghanistan was out of the question. How could it best be made to contribute to the tranquillity of the northern frontier of India? There were only two alternatives: to erect Afghanistan into a strong, united, and friendly buffer state, or to break it up and so render it impotent for mischief. Could the friendship of the tribesmen or of their ruler be really assured, the former was the obvious policy. But the tribesmen were hostile, and a ruler was still to seek. Lord Lytton decided, therefore, on the policy of disintegration. Kandahar, or Western Afghanistan, was promised to Sher Ali, a cousin of the late Amir, but Sher Ali declared truly enough that he could hold it only with the help of British troops. Northern Afghanistan was still unprovided for. Opportunely at this moment there appeared upon the scene the strong man so badly needed. A grandson of Dost Muhammad, Abdur Rahman had been for some time a semi-captive pensioner of Russia in Turkestan. He no sooner reappeared than the tribesmen rallied round him, and Lord Lytton offered to make him Amir of Kabul. But Abdur Rahman wanted to be Amir not of Kabul but of Afghanistan. He had not long to wait for the realization of his ambition. The new Amir had just been installed in Kabul, July 22nd, 1880, and the British preparations for evacuation were all but complete when a new danger arose. Ayub Khan, a brother of the late Amir Yaqub, gathered round him a large force of tribesmen in the Herat district, and announcing himself as a candidate for the throne, marched on Kandahar. General Primrose, left in command at Kandahar, sent out a brigade under Brigadier General Burrows to stop him. With a totally inadequate force, Burrows did his best to carry out his orders, but at Maiwand on July 27th his brigade was cut to pieces by a force overwhelmingly superior, and only a remnant got back to Kandahar. Primrose and his force in Kandahar were now in imminent danger. Kandahar itself was invested by the forces of Ayub Khan, flushed with recent victory. A notable resolution was now taken by the two great soldiers at Kabul. The government was inclined to attempt the relief of Kandahar from Quetta. Stewart and Roberts, with their ultimate approval, decided to do it from Kabul. Roberts, with 10,000 picked men, was to succour Kandahar. Stewart was to lead back the rest of the Kabul garrison to India. On August 9th, Roberts' famous march began. By the 31st he had covered the 318 miles of country that separate Kabul from Kandahar. On September 1st his triumph was confirmed and consummated by a brilliant victory over the Afghan forces outside Kandahar. Ayub's army was annihilated, and his political pretensions were destroyed. Roberts became the idol of the army and of his countrymen. The Afghan war was at an end. Even Lord Lytton shrank from the task of a permanent occupation of northern and central Afghanistan. But the disposition of events no longer rested with that brilliant though unlucky Viceroy. On the defeat of the Conservative party at the polls, April 1880, he at once tendered his resignation, and it was accepted. Lord Hartington reigned in Whitehall, Lord Ripon at Calcutta. The new government, despite strong protest from the Queen, determined upon a complete and immediate reversal of the policy of their predecessors. On one point only was there momentary hesitation. Lord Ripon himself realized the difficulty of abandoning Kandahar. Roberts regarded its retention as of vital importance. All the soldiers in India and most of the civilians were with him. The Queen ardently supported his views at home, but there were strong arguments on the other side. Sher Ali proved himself to be a weak creature, incapable of maintaining the position in which we had placed him without our help. Abdur Rahman regarded Kandahar as essential to his hold on Herat. To retain it meant friction with the Amir, hostility with the tribesmen, perhaps war with both. Lord Hartington, though not without grave consideration, decided that as soon as it could be done with dignity and safety, Kandahar must be evacuated. Lord Ripon was brought round to the view that the retention of Quetta would give us all the strategic advantage we could desire without the certain expense and possible danger of garrisoning Kandahar. Quetta was retained, and in April 1881 the evacuation of Kandahar was completed. Thus the Treaty of Gandamak was torn up, and Abdur Rahman ruled over a friendly, strong, and independent Afghanistan. The policy of disintegration was repudiated, and we reverted to that of a buffer state. Thanks to the timely emergence of a strong and exceptionally sagacious ruler, that policy relieved us of danger, though not of anxiety, for 20 years. Afghanistan was not the only problem bequeathed by the Beaconsfield Cabinet to their successors. The forward policy had been adopted in other parts of the world, and nowhere with more significant results than in South Africa. On April 12th, 1877, Sir Theophilus Shepstone, acting in accordance with the discretion allowed him by Lord Carnarvon, proclaimed the annexation of the Transvaal to the British Crown. This history has hitherto been silent as to the progress of British rule in South Africa, and the omission must now be repaired. From the middle of the 17th century down to the close of the 18th, Cape Colony was a dependency of the Dutch East India Company, being utilized by their ships as a port of call and by their sailors as a vegetable garden. In 1795, the United Provinces became a dependency of the French Republic, and to save the Cape Colony from a similar fate, it was occupied by a British force. Handed back to the Batavian Republic in 1802, it was reconquered by England in 1806, and at the Peace of Paris, 1814, it was purchased for £6 million from the Dutch Government and became the property of Great Britain. But though the government was British, the white inhabitants were mainly Dutch. Not until after 1820 was there any considerable emigration from this country. Between the British government, progressive in policy, and the Dutch farmers, strongly conservative in instinct, causes of friction rapidly developed, notably in regard to the treatment of the natives. The zeal of the English government and of the English missionaries was perhaps more obvious than their discretion, and with the enforcement of the Act for the abolition of slavery, the cup of Dutch indignation overflowed. That Act was administered with flagrant disregard for the interests of the Dutch farmers and with scant respect for their vested rights. They consequently determined to shake off the dust of the British government from their feet and to seek freedom in the vast hinterland of South Africa. This was the meaning of the Great Boer Trek, 1836 to 1840, the cardinal fact of South African history, and a story in some respects curiously romantic and pathetic. The ultimate result of the Great Trek was the establishment of two Boer states, virtually independent, the Transvaal and the Orange Free State. Meanwhile, a handful of English colonists had established themselves at Port Natal, 1824, but the Boers from the north and west of the Drakensberg range threatened their existence, and in the early 40s it seemed probable that a third Boer state would be established between the Drakensberg and the sea. In 1843, however, Natal was formally proclaimed to be a British colony, and the Boers, after a brief struggle, sullenly withdrew to the west of Drakensberg. Down to 1856, Natal was regarded as forming part of Cape Colony, but in that year it was declared independent, and it attained to the full dignity of responsible government in 1893. What were the relations between Cape Colony and the Boer states to the north? From the moment of the Trek, there were two possible alternatives open to the British government, either frankly to recognize the secession of the Boers and in due time to acknowledge the existence of European states in South Africa independent of the British flag, or to make it clear from the outset that no other power would be tolerated in South Africa, and that the Boer farmers, go where they would, must remain subject to the English crown. For either policy there was something to be said. Unfortunately for the credit of British rule in South Africa, we adopted neither, or rather we adopted both. Thus, in 1848, Sir Harry Smith, the English Governor of Cape Colony, issued a proclamation to the effect that the whole territory between the Orange and the Vaal rivers, as far east as the Drakensberg, was to be under the sovereignty of the Queen. The Dutch farmers under Pretorius protested against this assumption of sovereignty, but they were worsted in battle at Boomplatz, August 29th, 1848. Some of them fled to the north of the Vaal, the rest acquiesced with no good grace, and accepted the authority of the Queen and the Orange River sovereignty. The Home Government was lukewarm in its support of Sir Harry Smith. In 1851 the whole force of Cape Colony was engaged in one of the perennial struggles with the Kaffirs on the eastern frontier of the colony, and Pretorius, then an outlaw beyond the Vaal, threatened to raise an insurrection in the Orange sovereignty unless the independence of his countrymen to the north of the Vaal were recognized. Consequently, in 1852, the Sand River Convention was concluded. Great Britain thereby conceded to the emigrant farmers beyond the Vaal River the right to manage their own affairs and to govern themselves without any interference on the part of Her Majesty the Queen's government. Thus the South African or Transvaal Republic came into being as an independent state, but with two reservations. It was to be open to all comers on equal terms, and no slavery was to be permitted or practiced. Meanwhile, we were involved in troubles with the Basutos, the natives to the east of the Orange River sovereignty, and at the close of the war, General Cathcart, the officer in command, reported that it would be necessary to station 2,000 troops permanently in the sovereignty. The Home Government were in no mind for the assumption of further military responsibilities, and preferred the alternative of withdrawal. The Bloemfontein Convention was a counterpart of that concluded 2 years earlier with the Transvaal Boers. Thus the Orange Free State took its place side by side with the South African Republic, and it seemed as though a definite boundary were to be set to British sovereignty toward the northwest. For nearly 20 years the policy of non-intervention was consistently maintained. Meanwhile the Cape Colony itself advanced steadily toward the goal of self-government. During the vigorous and enlightened administration of Sir George Grey, 1854 to 1861, Cape Colony was endowed with an elected legislature and attained to responsible government in 1872. But Sir George Grey had a far wider vision than that bounded by the horizon of responsible government. Looking beyond the vacillating policy hitherto pursued by Great Britain in South Africa, he saw that the only possible path of safety lay in some form of federation. The State Paper in which in 1858 he submitted his views to the Home Government is one of the ablest documents in the history of our colonial empire. Grey had the support of the Boers of the Orange River sovereignty. Their Volksraad resolved in 1858 that a union or alliance with the Cape Colony, either on the plan of federation or otherwise, is desirable. But the only reply of the Colonial Office was to recall Grey for exceeding his instructions. He was restored by the personal intervention of the Queen, but he returned to Cape Town with a tarnished prestige and with gravely impaired authority. Had the Home Government grasped the problem as Sir George Grey grasped it, had they even had the sense to trust the man on the spot, the whole subsequent course of South African history might have been different. Mr. F. W. Reitz, the Transvaal Secretary of State in 1899, wrote to Sir George Grey in 1893, "Had British ministers in time past been wise enough to follow your advice, there would undoubtedly be today a British dominion extending from Table Bay to Zambesi." But the weary Titan was tired of the whole burden of colonial establishments, and was looking forward to the happy day when those wretched colonies would no longer hang like a millstone round our necks. Responsibilities once assumed are not, however, so lightly shaken off. Towards the end of the 60s, the period of masterly inactivity was drawing to a close in South Africa as in India. In 1868 the Boers on the Orange River became involved in a dispute with the Basutos to the east of them. The Basuto chief addressed a prayer to the British Government, "Let me and my people rest under the large folds of the flag of England." His prayer was heard, and in 1869 British sovereignty was proclaimed over Basutoland. In 1871 Griqualand West, a native territory to the west of the Orange State, was similarly annexed to the Crown. This important acquisition gave us the diamond fields of the Kimberley district. But the importance was not measured only in diamonds. The annexation meant a new turn to the wheel of policy, the definite abandonment of the laissez-faire attitude which for the last 30 years had been characteristic of British policy in South Africa as elsewhere. The acquisition of the Kimberley diamond field meant also a new strain in the social life of South Africa. The digger, the capitalist, the company promoter jostled the slow-moving Dutch farmer and quickened the pace of life. Such was the condition of affairs in South Africa when in 1874 Lord Carnarvon took up the reins at the Colonial Office. Lord Carnarvon was the minister who had been officially responsible for the enactment of a federal constitution for British North America, and he was anxious to confer a similar boon upon South Africa. The moment appeared not inopportune, for in 1872 a Federation Commission had been appointed in Cape Colony. But Cape Colony was in the first flush of self-satisfaction at the attainment of responsible government and had no leisure for the larger problem. Nevertheless, Lord Carnarvon wrote to the Governor of the Cape in 1875 to propose that the several states of South Africa should be invited to a conference to discuss native policy and other points of common interest, and to ventilate the all-important question of a possible union of South Africa in some form of confederation. The proposal was not welcomed in Cape Colony, and Mr. Froude, the eminent historian, who had been sent out to represent the Colonial Office at the proposed conference, found his position highly embarrassing both to himself and to his hosts. Froude put his finger with great acuteness upon the root difficulty. If we can make up our minds to allow the colonists to manage the natives their own way, we may safely confederate the whole country. Of federation, however, imposed upon them from London, the colonists would hear nothing. The conference in South Africa never met. Lord Carnarvon, not to be foiled, invited various gentlemen interested in South Africa to confer with him at the Colonial Office, August 1876. The Cape Premier, Mr. Molteno, happened to be in London, but was forbidden to attend. No delegate was present from the Transvaal, and Mr. Brand, President of the Orange Free State, who greatly impressed Froude, attended under strict injunctions from his Volksraad not to take part in any negotiation respecting federation by which the independence of his own state could be endangered. Sir Theophilus Shepstone and 2 members of the legislature represented Natal. As regards federation, the meeting was entirely abortive. Despite this discouragement, Lord Carnarvon sent out to South Africa in December 1876 the draft of a permissive confederation bill, which in the session of 1877 was passed into law by the Imperial Legislature. This enabling act contained the outline of a complete federal constitution. It was for the South African colonies to fill it in if they would. Lord Carnarvon, while insisting that the action of all parties, whether in the British colonies or the Dutch States, must be spontaneous and uncontrolled, informed the new Governor of the Cape that he had been selected to carry my scheme of confederation into effect. The man chosen for this high task was one of the most trusted and experienced servants of the Crown, one to whose life work the Confederation of South Africa might form an appropriate and noble crown. It was the expressed hope of his chief that within 2 years he would be the first Governor-General of South Africa. The words read ironically, for the reign of Sir Bartle Frere, 1877 to 1880, coincided through no fault of his own with the darkest period in South African history. End of Section 47. Section 48 of England since Waterloo by John Arthur Ransome Marriott. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 24. Afghanistan and South Africa, 1878 to 1880, Part 2. Less than a month after Sir Bartle Frere reached Cape Town, March 31st, 1877, another agent of Lord Carnarvon's took a step which opened a new chapter in British policy in South Africa. Sir Theophilus Shepstone was Secretary for Native Affairs in Natal, and no man had more intimate knowledge of the native problem. In October 1876 he was sent out by Lord Carnarvon as Special Commissioner to inquire respecting certain disturbances which had taken place in territories adjoining the colony of Natal. And he was authorized at his discretion, and provided it were desired by the inhabitants, to annex to the British Dominion all or part of the territories which formed the scene of his inquiry. The scene was the Transvaal Republic. At this moment the Boers of the Transvaal were in serious danger of annihilation at the hands of their native neighbours. More than this, the condition and policy of the Republic constituted a serious menace to the reputation and even the existence of the whole white population of South Africa. The Boers had incurred the bitter enmity of Cetewayo, king of the powerful tribe of the Zulus, as well as the Ndebele chief Lobengula. With another chief, Sekukun, they were in 1876 actually at war. Morally and materially the Boers were bankrupt, and their native enemies were only awaiting the opportunity to eat them up. That process might begin with the Boers, it was not likely to end with them. Under these circumstances, Shepstone, after 3 months of careful inquiry, decided that annexation was the only remedy for the disease, and on April 12, 1877, he took over the administration of the Transvaal in the Queen's name, promising to the Boers complete self-government under the British Crown. The President, Mr. Burgers, after a formal protest, retired to Cape Town on a pension. His rival, the Vice President, Mr. Kruger, proceeded to London and tried to persuade Lord Carnarvon to reverse the policy of his agent. This the Colonial Secretary declined to do. That the annexation saved the Boers of the Transvaal from destruction is hardly open to question, but it left the British government face to face in a more acute form than ever before with the native problem. A series of disputes with the Zulus led in January 1879 to the outbreak of war. The history of that war may be thus briefly summarized: one grievous disaster, several deeds of heightened heroism, one great and final victory. At Isandlwana, January 22nd, a British force of 800 whites and 500 natives was literally cut to pieces. This was the disaster more than half redeemed by the heroic defence of Rorke's Drift. For 11.5 hours, less than 100 men of the 24th, under 2 subalterns, Bromhead and Chard, held the drift against 4,000 Zulus. The defence of this post on the Buffalo Road saved Natal. The final victory was won by Lord Chelmsford at Ulundi in the Zulu territory on July 4th. Cetewayo was afterwards captured and sent as a prisoner to Cape Town, and the power of his people was finally broken. In the course of a war brief but full of incident, the exiled Prince Imperial of France, the heir of Napoleon III, who had volunteered to serve with the British force, was unfortunately killed in a reconnaissance June 1st, owing to the carelessness of the officer who had been entrusted with the operation. Before the year 1879 closed, a British force destroyed the power of Sekukun, and this inveterate enemy of the Boers joined Cetewayo in captivity. The Boers could now breathe freely. The English had destroyed their enemies. The Dutch leaders had never ceased to protest against annexation, and their visits to London led them to hope much for the rapid vicissitudes of party government. their hopes were not destined to disappointment. In the Transvaal, Frere found in 1879 that the Boers, despite official assertions in London, were confident that their country would be given back. The history of the retrocession of the Orange Free State had taught them a lesson. Most unfortunately, there had been grave procrastination in regard to the fulfilment of Shepstone's promise of self-government. In June 1879, Sir Garnet Wolseley was sent out to take over as High Commissioner, Supreme Civil and Military Command. Shortly after his arrival, a Crown Colony Constitution was conferred upon the Transvaal, but this was far short of the legitimate expectations of the Boers, and their disappointment was great. The new High Commissioner declared in the Queen's name that it was the will and determination of Her Majesty's Government that the Transvaal should remain forever an integral portion of Her Majesty's dominions in South Africa. Her Majesty's Government was about to change hands. In the autumn of 1879, Mr. Gladstone insisted in his Midlothian speeches on the insanity of the free subjects of a monarch going to coerce the free subjects of a republic. On coming into power in 1880, his government declared that under no circumstances can the Queen's authority in the Transvaal be relinquished. Bitter was the disappointment of the Boers, and on December 16th, 1880, Messrs. Kruger, Pretorius, and Joubert issued a proclamation declaring the independence of the Transvaal Republic. The moment was well chosen. The Basuto rebellion was in full progress, the Transvaal was almost denuded of British troops, and on December 10th some companies of the 94th were surprised and cut to pieces at Bronker Spruit, a place about 40 miles from Pretoria. Sir George Colley had succeeded Wolseley in July, and with a small force he hurried up to Newcastle in January 1881. Checked with heavy loss at Laing's Nek, January 28th, and again at Ingogo, February 7th, he met his death in the disastrous defeat at Majuba Hill, February 26th. Ireland combined with South Africa to compel an early meeting of Parliament, January 6th, 1881, and the Queen's speech emphasized the duty of taking military measures with a view to the prompt vindication of my authority. Sir Frederick Roberts was sent out in command of a considerable force, but he arrived in South Africa only to find that Sir Evelyn Wood, who succeeded Colley, had signed an agreement with the Boers acknowledging their right to complete self-government under the suzerainty of the Queen, March 23rd. The Pretoria Convention, in which these terms were embodied, was amended 3 years later by the Convention of London, February 27th, 1884. The latter treaty acknowledged the South African Republic, and while retaining the control of external relations, deleted all reference to the suzerainty of the Queen. The whole policy of retrocession was violently assailed by the Conservative opposition in England, and it signally failed to achieve a final settlement in South Africa. Between 1881 and the close of the century, a series of profound changes passed over South Africa. British sovereignty was extended over Bechuanaland, 1885, over Zululand, 1886, and in 1889 the British South Africa Company was incorporated by royal charter and accepted the administration of Mashonaland. In 1894 the company broke the power of the Ndebele's and annexed their territory. The conclusion of a convention with Germany in 1890 and with Portugal in 1891 reminded us and others that we had European neighbours in South Africa. Meanwhile, in the Transvaal itself, an event of first-rate importance had taken place. Gold in great profusion was discovered in 1886 on the Witwatersrand, and the discovery attracted a crowd of adventurers who introduced into the social and economic life of the South African Republic an entirely new strain. The slow-moving, intensely conservative farmers deeply resented this intrusion. Oil would not mix with water. The newcomers demanded political rights commensurate with their contribution to the wealth of the community. The Boer government refused to grant them. At the close of the year 1895, the Uitlanders attempted to take by force what was denied to argument. Dr. Jameson, the administrator of the British South Africa Company, raided with an armed force the Transvaal territory. His force was crushed, his confederates in Johannesburg were imprisoned, Jameson himself and his comrades were handed over to the British government. The fiasco of the raid served only to increase the tension between the Boer oligarchy and the Uitlanders in the Transvaal, and at the same time rendered it more difficult for the paramount power to interfere. In 1897, Sir Alfred, now Viscount Milner, was appointed to succeed Sir Hercules Robinson as High Commissioner. In April 1899 he forwarded to the Queen a petition signed by 21,000 British subjects resident in the Transvaal, praying that the Queen would make inquiry into their grievances and secure for them an adequate and permanent remedy. In May 1899 the High Commissioner met President Kruger in conference at Bloemfontein. The conference proved abortive, and on October 10th the two Boer republics declared war. The war opened disastrously for Great Britain, but the resistance of the Boers was gradually worn down, and in May 1902 peace was concluded at Vereeniging on the Vaal. The long contest for supremacy in South Africa was at last ended, and ended in the only possible way. The two burgher states were annexed to the British Crown. Peace was no sooner signed than matters began to settle down with remarkable rapidity. So rapidly that it was found possible to confer self-government upon the Transvaal in 1906 and upon the Orange River Colony in 1907. But as in the case of Canada and Australia, the attainment of responsibility was but the prelude to a further development. The Union Act of 1909 brought the four self-governing colonies into a political union. Thus was the dream of Sir George Grey and Lord Carnarvon more than fulfilled. They had dreamt of confederation, but while the constitutions of Canada and Australia were genuinely federal, that of South Africa is unitary. The four colonies merged their identity in that of United South Africa, and accept henceforward the status of provinces. With the Union Act, the final stage in the constitutional evolution of South Africa has, we may presume, been reached. Spasmodic violence, alternating with impatient dropping of the reins, first severity and then indulgence and then severity again, with no persisting in any one system, a process which drives nations mad as it drives children. Such was Froude's summary of England's dealing with South Africa in the 19th century. The 20th opens with a happier prospect. We must now return, after a prolonged parenthesis, to the closing days of the Beaconsfield administration. The threatenings of war in Eastern Europe, a forward policy eventuating in war both in Afghanistan and South Africa, such were the questions which, to the casual observer, seemed to dominate the political situation. Not so did the Prime Minister read the signs of the times. On the eve of the election of 1880, Lord Beaconsfield indited to the Duke of Marlborough, then Lord Lieutenant of Ireland, a letter which was in effect a political manifesto. It sought to concentrate the attention of the electorate upon a single topic. Ireland was distracted by a danger in its ultimate results scarcely less disastrous than pestilence and famine, by an attempt to sever the constitutional tie which unites it to Great Britain in that bond which has formed the power and prosperity of both. Throughout the first years of Lord Beaconsfield's administration, Ireland had enjoyed a spell of unusual prosperity and tranquillity. That spell was broken by agricultural depression in 1878. But the cardinal feature of the Irish question during the Conservative regime was not economic but political. The years between 1874 and 1880 witnessed the growth of a new Irish party both in Ireland itself and at Westminster. Mr. Gladstone complacently believed that he had discharged in full the debt of England to Ireland. The majority of the Irish electors did not share his optimism, and it is a grim commentary upon this view that the first general election after the passing of the Acts of 1869 and 1870 should have resulted in the return for the first time of a majority of Irish members pledged to the repeal of the Union. But although the Home Rulers numbered close on 60 in the Parliament of 1874, Mr. Butts's annual motion was treated with contemptuous indifference. Legislation for Ireland did not occupy much of the time of this Parliament. The Peace Preservation Act was renewed in 1875, though with considerable modification, for a further period of 5 years. The Westmeath Act was renewed until 1877, but the most important legislation of this Parliament had reference to education. $1 million of money from the Irish Church surplus was appropriated in 1878 to the encouragement of intermediate education, and in 1879 a further $1.25 million was taken from the same source to provide pensions for elementary teachers. The same year witnessed successful legislation on the question which had brought disaster upon Mr. Gladstone. If the scope of Lord Beaconsfield's Irish University Act has been as a rule misunderstood, if the criticism of it is generally distorted, the fault lies partly with its author. Under a most unpretentious aspect, the Act contained the germ of a great concession. The Queen's University was abolished, and in its place the Royal University of Ireland was set up. The new university was to be primarily an examining body, but the point which has escaped attention is that it was supplied with the means of rewarding merit by fellowships, scholarships, and prizes. Of this indirect endowment the Roman Catholics have freely availed themselves. Thus the difficulty as to the state endowment of a sectarian institution was surmounted, or rather circumvented, with singular adroitness. "This is done," said Lord Beaconsfield in private conversation, "in such a way that it will not be understood, and when in due time the people of Great Britain find that they are accepting the principle of an endowment which is quite inadequate, their sense of justice will cause them to admit that the Irish Roman Catholics are entitled to a properly endowed university college. In fact, what we are doing is to place the ball at the feet of the Roman Catholics, and if they do not kick it, the fault will be theirs and not ours." The conversation is well vouched for and is eminently characteristic. Disraeli was never happier than when educating his party and his countrymen. The morality of his methods might be questioned, but their ingenuity was undeniable. During the period that followed, the Irish Roman Catholics kicked the ball to some purpose, but it is questionable whether the people of Great Britain ever realized that it had been placed surreptitiously at their feet. By this time, however, a new force had made itself manifest in Irish politics, and a new movement had been inaugurated. Isaac Butt passed away, a weary and disappointed man, in 1879. His nominal successor in the leadership of the Home Rule party was Mr. Shaw, but some time before Butt's death a new leader had leapt to the front in the person of Charles Stewart Parnell. Mr. Parnell was an Irish landowner of gentle birth, on his father's side an Anglo-Celt, on his mother's side an American. He had none of the gifts of the demagogue, least of all the Irish demagogue. No natural gift of speech, no passion, no presence. On the other hand, he was a born leader of men, and he acquired in high degree the art of parliamentary tactics. Watchful, acute, restrained, he rarely made a blunder in the House of Commons, and never missed an opportunity. For English politicians and English people he had a genuine contempt, mingled with a hatred which was as near passionate as any feeling he could entertain. To his Irish confederates his attitude was one of consistent hauteur and aloofness. Inscrutable as Disraeli, he was as absolute in authority as Gladstone. He was only just of age when his sympathies were excited by the execution of the Fenian prisoners in Manchester. A visit to America, 1871, confirmed both his sympathy for Fenianism and his hatred of England. He entered Parliament in 1875, took the measure of that assembly in a moment, and within 2 years was one of the most powerful forces in the House. He decided from the first that Home Rule must be achieved by tactics at Westminster and by agitation in Ireland and America. For English opinion he cared nothing, and he set himself deliberately to defy and to degrade the House of Commons by a policy of obstruction. In 1878 he cemented an alliance with the Clan na Gael or New Fenians by a second visit to America, and convinced the Irish Americans for the first time of the efficacy of parliamentary action. In the same year he found a valuable, though not entirely congenial ally, in an ex-convict, Michael Davitt, recently released on ticket of leave from Dartmoor, where he had been serving a term of imprisonment for being concerned with the secret importation of firearms into the kingdom. Davitt was not only a separatist but a socialist, a disciple of Henry George, and convinced that the sovereign remedy for the economic and social disease of Ireland was the nationalization of the land. With this particular prescription Parnell had no sympathy, but Davitt made a useful ally, and in 1879 the Land League was founded, with Parnell as its first president. The avowed objects of the League were to reduce rack rents and to facilitate the purchase of farms by the cultivators. The real object was the complete destruction of Irish landlordism, because landlordism was a British garrison which barred the way to national independence. Circumstances were favourable to this new agrarian campaign. The harvest of 1879 was the worst since the famine, and the distress in Ireland was so great that the Duchess of Marlborough opened a special relief fund, and the government advanced funds from the church surplus to be supplied through the landlords to reproductive works. Lord Beaconsfield, therefore, was not merely attempting to divert attention from his own misdeeds when, in his historic letter to the Duke of Marlborough, he directed the interest of his countrymen to the condition of Ireland, but a voice much more powerful at the moment than Lord Beaconsfield was exposing from the housetops the dead fruits of imperialism. The outstanding feature of the general election of 1880 was beyond all question the Midlothian campaign waged in the district round Edinburgh by Mr. Gladstone with a vigour and resourcefulness wonderful for any man, miraculous in a man of over 70. The results were not incommensurate with the effort. The campaign gave the Liberals a majority of nearly 120 over the Conservatives, of 50 over Conservatives and Home Rulers combined. But the campaign did more than give the Liberals a large majority. It put Mr. Gladstone in power. Since his definite retirement in 1875, the party in the House of Commons had been led with excellent temper and dignity, though not quite effectively, by Lord Hartington. But it was Lord Granville whom Mr. Gladstone invariably regarded as the leader of the party and his destined successor in the premiership. Lord Beaconsfield accepted his unexpected defeat with unruffled equanimity, and following the precedent he had himself set in 1868, he resigned before the meeting of Parliament, April 21st. The Queen immediately sent for Lord Hartington. Lord Hartington had accepted the leadership with reluctance and had been deeply embarrassed by the role which, after his retirement, Mr. Gladstone felt it his duty to play. Against his will, he retained the leadership, but having done so, he looked forward to the fitting reward on the victory of his party at the polls. His advice to the Queen, however, was to send for Mr. Gladstone. Her Majesty demurred, and only consented when it was made clear to her by Lord Hartington and Lord Granville conjointly that Mr. Gladstone would accept no place but the first, and that they could not form a government without him. The Queen acquiesced, and on April 23rd Mr. Gladstone kissed hands as First Lord of the Treasury and Chancellor of the Exchequer. Lord Granville took the Foreign Office, Lord Hartington the India Office, Lord Selborne again became Lord Chancellor, Lord Kimberley Colonial Secretary, Forster Chief Secretary for Ireland, Lord Northbrook took the Admiralty and Childers the War Office. 2 recruits were brought into the Cabinet, Sir William Harcourt as Home Secretary and Mr. Joseph Chamberlain as President of the Board of Trade. Mr. Henry Fawcett, though not in the Cabinet, made noteworthy his tenure of the Post Office, and Sir Charles Dilke represented with uncommon ability the Foreign Office in the House of Commons. Before we turn to the history of the Gladstone Ministry, a word may be said as to the causes of the Conservative debacle. The first may be found in the law of anticlimax. Had Lord Beaconsfield yielded to the temptation of dissolving in 1878, he would probably, though not certainly, have secured a new term of office for his party. Down to that time their record, both administrative and legislative, was a good one. Mr. Cross had made a notable success at the Home Office. Their finance was respectable and their general administration was sound. After 1878, everything went wrong. Trade and agriculture became increasingly depressed. The impudent tactics of Parnell in the House of Commons impaired the reputation of its leader. The defeat at Isandlwana was followed by the tragedy at Kabul. But while these things may account for the defeat of the Conservatives, the victory of the Liberals was due to another cause. It was the moral fervour of Mr. Gladstone, which recaptured the straying allegiance of the Nonconformists, and his resort to new political methods, which for the first time aroused the enthusiasm of the newly enfranchised masses. It is easy to condemn those methods as demagogic, to lament the degradation of British politics, to sigh for the days of greater dignity, repose, and restraint. But the Midlothian campaign was more than the triumph of oratory, more even than the victory of personality. It was the recognition of a stupendous change coming over the face of the political waters, the shifting of the centre of political gravity from Parliament to the platform, from the House of Commons to the constituencies, from the classes to the masses. That change was first registered by the plebiscite which in 1880 placed Mr. Gladstone in power. End of section 48.